Imagine for a second that everything you believed about Jesus' teachings was just a sliver of the whole damn truth. Picture a text, buried for centuries, holding the most raw, profound words the Master ever spoke. But the religious brass? They decided to keep it locked down, hidden in the shadows, because its message was too revolutionary, too dangerous for the kind of control they had over the masses. This isn't some conspiracy theory out of a cheap paperback, folks. This is a historical reality, silenced for nearly 2 millennia. The Gospel of Thomas, also known as the Gospel of the Twin, stands as one of the most explosive and controversial finds in modern biblical archaeology. A document that blows apart everything the institutional church has drilled into us about the divine, salvation, and the road to spiritual enlightenment. When archaeologists cracked open the Nag Hammadi manuscripts in Egypt, they didn't have a clue they were about to blow the lid off our understanding of early Christianity. Buried among those ancient scrolls was a treasure sitting out in the desert since the 4th century, when the church's early councils decided which texts made the cut as sacred and which ones got branded heretical. The Gospel of Thomas doesn't tell Jesus' story like the standard Gospels. No birth, no miracles, no crucifixion. Instead, it lays out something far more direct and, frankly, disturbing. 114 sayings attributed straight to Jesus. These are words that cut right to the gut of humanity's deepest mysteries, hinting at a path to the divine that doesn't need middlemen, doesn't require institutions, and sure as hell doesn't depend on outside salvation. The opening line of this forbidden gospel? It's devastating in its simplicity and the punch it packs. These are the secret sayings that the living Jesus spoke and Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down. Secret words. Let that sink in. Not for the public, not for the masses, but intimate teachings held back for those truly ready to handle the truth in its rawest, most challenging form. Why secret? What was in these teachings that made them so dangerous they had to be buried? The answers to those questions threaten to shake the very foundations of everything we think we know about Christ's original message and the nature of our own inner divinity. The Gospel's second saying lays down a promise that blows anything you hear in Sunday service out of the water. Let him who seeks continue seeking until he finds. When he finds, he will be troubled. When he is troubled, he will marvel and will reign over the all. This ain't an invite to blind faith or passive obedience. This is a radical call to personal investigation, to deep questioning, and to uncovering a truth that will flip your whole perception of reality on its head. It's a promise that the sincere seeker won't just find answers, but will unearth their own divine nature and the inherent power to reign over the all. These words hit hard, resonating across centuries because they tap into something fundamental in the human experience, that deep craving to know our true nature and our purpose in this cosmic mess. But here's the rub, and it's precisely the problem the early church authorities faced. If every Joe Schmo can tap directly into the divine, if every human soul holds that divine spark capable of enlightenment without needing priests, rituals, or institutions, then the whole damn structure of organized religious power comes crashing down. The Gospel of Thomas doesn't paint Jesus as some sacrificial lamb or the sole Son of God, but as a teacher who reveals humanity's own inherent divinity. Scholars who've busted their hump for decades analyzing this extraordinary text have found its age could go head-to-head with, maybe even predate, the canonical Gospels we're familiar with. Rigorous investigations suggest some of the teachings in the Gospel of Thomas might represent the most authentic words of Jesus to reach us, preserved in their purest form because they didn't get run through the filter of later doctrinal spin. This possibility has sent shockwaves through academic and theological circles, because it implies we've been building our understanding of Christianity on an incomplete foundation, worshiping an edited and censored snapshot of Christ's real message. The historical context where this gospel got suppressed tells a tale of an epic battle between wildly different interpretations of early Christianity. For the first few centuries after Jesus' death, there wasn't one unified church. There were multiple Christian communities, each with radically different takes on the Master's message. Some of these communities, especially those leaning into Gnostic teachings, didn't see Jesus as humanity's sole savior, but as the guy who revealed the divinity living inside every single human being. For them, salvation didn't come from believing in some external sacrifice, but from direct knowledge of our own divine nature, from recognizing that we are, in essence, sparks of the same cosmic light that shone fully in Christ. This perspective was, naturally, a damn threat to those religious honchos looking to establish solid institutional authority and tight doctrinal control over Christian communities. If every individual could tap directly into the divine, if enlightenment was every human soul's birthright and not some exclusive gift mediated by the church, then the power of bishops, priests, and church bigwigs lost its entire foundation. It was far more convenient for the religious establishment to push a vision of Christ as the only Son of God, whose grace could only be accessed through sacraments and the mediation of the institutional church. When Emperor Constantine called the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, one of the main gigs was to hammer out a unified Christian orthodoxy that could serve as the Roman Empire's official religion. This whole process required a careful selection of texts that backed the institutional view of Christianity and the condemnation of anything that pushed more mystical, direct, or individualized interpretations of Christ's message. The Gospel of Thomas, with its teachings on inner divinity and every soul's capacity for enlightenment without middlemen, was exactly the kind of text that needed to be cut out of the official Christian tradition. The decision to ditch this gospel from the canonical Bible wasn't about historical authenticity or spiritual value. Nope, it was about political and strategic calculations, plain and simple. What kind of Christianity best served the powers that be? Texts that pushed obedience to authority, the need for church mediation, and salvation's exclusivity through the church? Those got preserved and promoted. Meanwhile, anything celebrating individual spiritual autonomy and direct access to the divine got branded heresy and systematically destroyed. But some of these forbidden texts managed to slip through, surviving in secret communities and hidden libraries, just waiting for the right time to resurface and challenge the official narratives. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi manuscripts? That was the crucial moment when the silent history finally got its voice, revealing the hidden dimensions of Christ's original message. The Gospel of Thomas making it through the centuries? That's a fascinating tale of spiritual defiance and textual survival, giving us a peek into the internal turf wars of early Christianity. While the religious authorities were busy scrubbing out any evidence of alternative interpretations of Christ's message, small pockets of mystic devotees secretly copied and stashed these sacred texts in remote spots, risking their necks to preserve what they saw as the Master's authentic wisdom. These anonymous guardians of forbidden knowledge understood they were protecting something infinitely precious, a take on Christianity that could radically transform how humanity understood spirituality and our connection to the divine. Out in the dry, dusty lands of Egypt, especially around Nag Hammadi, communities of Gnostic monks and mystic Christians set up secret libraries. They meticulously copied these texts onto papyrus, then buried them in sealed ceramic jars, just waiting for a day when it might be safe to reintroduce them to the world. These wise men and women had a hunch that the orthodoxy shoved down their throats by the Roman Empire wasn't the whole Christian truth, just a politically convenient version, molded to serve the interests of temporal power. Their act of preservation? That was spiritual resistance, a silent bet on the future, that humanity would eventually be ready for these deeper, liberating teachings. If you're hooked by how these texts defied the odds, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell so you don't miss any of our deep dives into the hidden mysteries of early Christianity. Your support helps us keep digging and spilling these historical truths that have been buried for far too long. The translation and interpretation process of the Gospel of Thomas immediately spilled the beans on why the church authorities considered it so dangerous. Its teachings present a radically different Jesus from the one we find in the canonical Gospels, a teacher who constantly hammers home every human's inherent ability to awaken to their own divine nature. Instead of salvation being something handed down from on high, the Gospel of Thomas describes a path of spiritual self-realization where each individual can directly discover their identity as a son or daughter of God. This perspective completely blows away the need for religious middlemen and fundamentally shatters the whole damn hierarchical structure that had built up in institutional Christianity. The words attributed to Jesus in this text consistently talk about the kingdom of heaven as a present reality that can be experienced right here, right now, by those with eyes to see and ears to hear. It's not some future payoff reserved for the obedient faithful, but a state of consciousness immediately available to anyone willing to put in the inner work to wake up from the illusion of separation. This teaching implies that divinity isn't some external force to be worshipped and feared, but our own deepest essence that needs to be recognized and brought to life through spiritual practice and self-knowledge. What's really revolutionary in the Gospel of Thomas is its laser focus on personal responsibility for spiritual growth. Instead of hammering on blind faith in established doctrines or unquestioning obedience to religious authorities, it lays out a path that demands active investigation, deep contemplation, and direct experience. Its teachings suggest that spiritual truth can't just be believed or passively accepted. It has to be lived, experienced, and integrated through the conscious work of personal transformation. This perspective turns every spiritual seeker into their own priest and prophet, effectively cutting out the middleman when it comes to accessing the sacred. The esoteric nature of many teachings in the Gospel of Thomas also spills the beans that early Christianity included initiatic wisdom traditions, much like what you'd find in other ancient spiritual paths. Jesus shows up not just as a savior who died for humanity's sins, but as an enlightened master who passed down specific techniques for meditation, contemplation, and consciousness transformation. His teachings about finding what's hidden, about knowing oneself, about transcending the dualities of ordinary perception, reflect a sophisticated grasp of the psychological and spiritual processes involved in spiritual awakening. These revelations force us to hit the reset button on our entire understanding of who Jesus really was and what his original message stood for. Instead of the dogmatic Christ of later orthodoxy, the Gospel of Thomas introduces us to a master of consciousness whose teachings surprisingly line up with the deepest mystical traditions from other spiritual cultures. His words resonate with the wisdom of Buddhist masters on the illusory nature of the separate self, with Vedic teachings on the fundamental identity between the individual soul and cosmic consciousness, and with the insights of Greek philosophers on the reality of the invisible world behind the material appearances. The suppression of these teachings, an incalculable loss for humanity, plain and simple. It deprived generations of Christians of access to deeply transformative spiritual tools that could have significantly sped up their spiritual evolution. Instead of a religion built on guilt, fear, and dependence on external authorities, Christianity could have developed into a wisdom tradition centered on spiritual empowerment, personal responsibility, and the direct realization of our divine nature. The Western world might have dodged centuries of religious wars, persecutions, and sectarian conflicts if it had embraced a more inclusive and mystical interpretation of Christ's message. The transformation Christianity underwent during its first few centuries, that's one of the most dramatic flip-flops in the history of religious ideas. When we stack the teachings preserved in the Gospel of Thomas against what eventually became official Christian doctrine, we can see how a message originally focused on personal transformation and spiritual awakening was gradually reformulated to emphasize institutional obedience and dependence on external authorities. This process wasn't some accident. It reflected the political and social needs of a religion trying to establish itself as the Roman Empire's dominant faith. Ecclesiastical leaders of the 2nd and 3rd centuries faced the challenge of building an organizational structure capable of holding doctrinal unity across vast territories and diverse populations. The mystical and esoteric teachings of early Christianity, with their emphasis on direct experience and personal interpretation, were a real obstacle to this unification goal. It was far easier to maintain doctrinal control by setting specific creeds everyone had to swallow without question, rather than allowing the diversity of interpretations and spiritual experiences that marked the earliest Christian communities. The Church Fathers, guys like Irenaeus, Tertullian, and later Augustine, systematically cooked up theological arguments to justify why Gnostic and mystical teachings had to be branded heretical. They claimed only texts written by Jesus' direct apostles could be considered authentic, setting up canonicity criteria that favored texts supporting a more literal and less mystical interpretation of Christianity. However, modern research has blown the whistle, showing that many of the texts rejected by the emerging orthodoxy, including the Gospel of Thomas, might have historical roots as old or older than some of the texts included in the canonical New Testament. This revelation suggests the criteria used to determine authentic texts were influenced by political considerations as much as genuine concerns about doctrinal integrity. The institutionalization of Christianity hit its peak during Emperor Constantine's reign in the 4th century. When Constantine legalized Christianity with the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, The religion that had been persecuted suddenly morphed into a powerful political force. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, called by the emperor himself, hammered out the doctrinal foundations that would define Orthodox Christianity for the next 1700 years. However, the council records reveal that the decisions made were heavily influenced by political considerations about the unity of the empire, as much as by genuine theological concerns. The bishops who showed up mainly represented regions where institutional Christianity had gained stronger control, while the voices of Christian communities holding on to more mystical and esoteric traditions were effectively shut out of the process. The consolidation of ecclesiastical power during this period coincided with a systematic campaign to destroy or suppress texts that contradicted the new official orthodoxy. Gnostic texts, including the Gospel of Thomas, were declared heretical, and their possession was banned under pain of excommunication or even harsher penalties. Entire libraries were confiscated and burned, especially in regions like Egypt, where alternative Christian traditions had flourished for centuries. It was only by an accidental historical fluke, thanks to the dry climate of the Egyptian desert and the practice of monks stashing texts in ceramic jars, that some of these documents survived to be rediscovered in modern times. The Nag Hammadi Library, unearthed in 1945, represents a mere fraction of the early Christian literature that was systematically wiped out during the 4th and 5th centuries. This suppression wasn't just about written texts. It also extended to spiritual practices, rituals, and oral traditions that had been passed down from the earliest generations of Jesus's followers. Meditation techniques, mystical contemplation methods, and consciousness transformation practices, integral parts of early Christianity, were gradually sidelined or reinterpreted in terms that were less threatening to institutional authority. For example, references to the direct experience of the divine were reinterpreted as descriptions of exclusive events experienced only by exceptional saints, instead of spiritual potentialities accessible to all sincere seekers. This reinterpretation effectively transformed Christianity from a path of personal awakening into something else entirely. It was a street-smart wisdom tradition, twisted and shoved into a belief system that pushed intellectual faith over transformative, gut-level experience. The fallout from this transformation spread way beyond the borders of the Christian religion itself. Back in the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church became the biggest game in Europe, calling the shots on not just religious beliefs but also education, politics, and the whole cultural scene. Knowledge of alternative spiritual traditions got tucked away in the shadows, mostly in esoteric monastic orders, underground mystic crews, and alchemical traditions that kept the flame of inner seeking burning, even with the official crackdown. But these groups were always looking over their shoulder, under constant threat, and many of their members were hunted down and put to death as heretics when the orthodox hammer came down. The rediscovery of texts like the Gospel of Thomas in the 20th century has allowed us to piece together some of the spiritual wealth that got buried for centuries of suppression. When we stack up the teachings preserved in these texts against the mystical traditions that survived in other spiritual cultures, we can see just how much was lost when these perspectives got cut from mainstream Christianity. The teachings of Jesus preserved in the Gospel of Thomas show a psychological and spiritual depth that stands shoulder to shoulder with the heaviest texts from any spiritual tradition out there, hinting that early Christianity had tools and insights that could have really moved the needle on Western humanity's spiritual growth. The implications of this systematic suppression get even clearer when we specifically examine how the Gospel of Thomas presents teachings that directly call out some of the core tenets of institutional Christianity. While the Orthodox tradition pushes the idea that you need priestly middlemen to get to the divine, Thomas, though, holds on to sayings from Jesus that point to a direct, immediate hit of spiritual reality. The saying that declares the kingdom of heaven is both inside and out, and that those who know themselves will find it, presents a radically different take on salvation and spiritual transformation. This teaching suggests that enlightenment isn't some handout from an outside authority, but a realization that just naturally pops up when a seeker truly understands their own nature. The institutional pushback against these ideas makes perfect sense when we consider the political and social implications of a spirituality built on direct experience, rather than dogmatic authority. If every individual's got the inherent chops to directly tap into spiritual truth, then the whole need for a mediating church hierarchy gets called into question. Gnostic texts, including the Gospel of Thomas, preserve precisely this kind of teaching. ones that empower the individual seeker and downplay the heavy hand of authoritarian structures. References to inner light, the awakening of consciousness, and the discovery of the true self point to a spiritual path that's fundamentally democratic and open to everyone, no matter their social standing or church rank. Modern research into early Christian history has laid bare that this tug-of-war between direct spiritual experience and institutional authority wasn't just a second-century thing. It kept playing out across Christian history. Medieval mystic movements, like the Cathars in France, the Bogomils in the Balkans, and various Beguine groups in Northern Europe, held on to elements of this experiential spirituality that hit hard with the teachings found in texts like Thomas's. But these movements were systematically hunted down and wiped out by the official church, not just for their specific theological takes, but for their focus on direct spiritual experience, which threatened the whole hierarchical power structure of religion. The psychological sophistication packed into the Gospel of Thomas's teachings really shines through when we stack them up against modern developments in transpersonal psychology and consciousness studies. The sayings that talk about unifying opposites, transcending duality, and realizing an identity that goes beyond the ordinary ego anticipate insights that contemporary researchers, digging into altered states of consciousness and mystical experiences, have only just rediscovered. This suggests that early Christian communities that preserved these texts had a deep read on psychological and spiritual transformation that later got lost when Christianity leaned into more doctrinal, less experiential formulations. What's really telling is the fact that many of the practices and concepts that got suppressed from Western Christianity kept developing in other spiritual traditions that didn't get slammed with the same level of authoritarian institutionalization. Contemplative meditation techniques, methods for cultivating altered states of consciousness, and experimental approaches to spiritual realization flourished in traditions like Islamic Sufism, Hindu Vedanta, and Mahayana Buddhism, suggesting that the potential for this kind of spiritual development is universal, not just locked down to specific traditions. When we examine the teachings of the Gospel of Thomas from this comparative perspective, we can see they represent a version of Christianity that could have evolved into something pretty close to these other contemplative traditions if it hadn't been suppressed. The 20th century rediscovery and reinterpretation of these texts has synced up with a renewed interest in experiential spirituality and the psychology of consciousness transformation. Contemporary scholars have started to wise up to the fact that Gnostic texts like the Gospel of Thomas don't represent heretical deviations from authentic Christianity, but rather preserved aspects of Jesus' movement that got marginalized later on for political and social reasons, not theological ones. This reevaluation has sparked a fresh appreciation for the diversity and richness of early Christianity, and a recognition that the versions of Christianity that historically came out on top represent just a fraction of the spiritual possibilities alive in those early Christian communities. The implications of this understanding stretch way beyond the ivory tower of biblical studies and religious history. For folks today looking for an authentic, transformative spirituality, the rediscovery of these teachings offers spiritual resources that had been effectively ghosted from Western civilization for over 1,500 years. The techniques and perspectives preserved in texts like the Gospel of Thomas offer practical tools for consciousness transformation that can either beef up or even replace spiritual approaches that lean mostly on intellectual belief or dogmatic conformity. The radical nature of these consciousness transformations laid out in the Gospel of Thomas throws up fundamental questions about the relationship between direct knowing and institutional authority. When Jesus talks about becoming one with the divine through deep self-knowledge, he's describing a process that, by its very nature, challenges any system of outside mediation. That largely explains why later church authorities found these concepts so troubling. They imply every individual's got a direct line to spiritual truth without needing institutional middlemen. The Nag Hammadi manuscripts spill the beans, revealing these ideas weren't fringe or peripheral in early Christianity, but part of a mainstream current of thought that went head-to-head with the more hierarchical, doctrinal interpretations that eventually won out. Recent studies of these texts have shown that the communities who preserved them had sophisticated systems of spiritual practice that blended contemplative, psychological, and philosophical elements in ways that foreshadow many contemporary transpersonal psychology developments. What's especially significant is that these teachings lay out a vision of salvation that's fundamentally different from the redemption models that came to dominate Western Christian thought. Instead of focusing on sin forgiveness through vicarious sacrifice, the Gospel of Thomas describes a process of gradual awakening where individuals uncover their inherent divine nature. This approach puts the spiritual transformation squarely on the individual, cutting out the need for complex systems of priestly intercession and dogmatic authority. The systematic suppression of these texts during Christianity's early centuries wasn't some accident. It was part of a deliberate power grab by the institution. The church authorities who rose up during the post-Constantinian era recognized that Gnostic teachings were an existential threat to their authority, since they handed individuals direct ways to tap into transformative spiritual experiences without relying on institutional mediation. This tension between direct experiential spirituality and institutional control has pretty much defined Christian history right up to today. Modern research has shown that many of the spiritual practices described or implied in the Gospel of Thomas have striking parallels with contemplative techniques that developed independently in other spiritual traditions. The practice of silent contemplation described in various sayings of Thomas, for example, presents uncanny similarities to meditation methods cooked up in Zen Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta. This hints that these techniques are universal breakthroughs about the nature of consciousness, not just culturally specific innovations. The transformation process described in these texts also lines up with what contemporary psychologists have pegged as post-conventional consciousness development. Individuals who go through these awakening processes develop capacities for direct perception of realities not accessible through ordinary modes of cognition. This capacity for direct perception of spiritual truth is exactly what Thomas's teachings describe as the payoff for deep self-knowledge. The political and social implications of these teachings reach far beyond the immediate religious context. When individuals develop the capacity for direct perception of the truth, they become less susceptible to manipulation by outside authorities, whether religious, political, or cultural. This spiritual autonomy throws a fundamental wrench into all control systems that rely on keeping populations in states of psychological and spiritual dependency. The rediscovery of these texts in our contemporary world has lined up with a deep crisis hitting traditional religious institutions. Millions of folks worldwide are ditching organized religion, chasing after more authentic, transformative spiritual experiences. For many of these people, the teachings preserved in texts like the Gospel of Thomas offer spiritual resources that had been effectively lost to Western civilization for centuries. The contemporary relevance of these teachings also spills over into mental health and psychological development. Researchers studying non-ordinary states of consciousness have found that the experiences described in Gnostic texts show striking parallels with what transpersonal psychology has tagged as authentic spiritual awakening experiences. This suggests these ancient texts hold knowledge about human potential for consciousness transformation that could be relevant for tackling many of the psychological and spiritual challenges people face in today's world. Still, integrating these perspectives into the contemporary context comes with its own unique set of challenges. Western societies have built up psychological and social structures that presuppose models of human development fundamentally different from those described in these ancient texts. Most folks have been conditioned to chase validation and meaning through external achievements and social conformity, rather than through the kind of deep introspection and consciousness transformation these texts lay out. This cultural conditioning stands as one of the biggest roadblocks to practically applying these teachings today. The spiritual techniques preserved in the Gospel of Thomas demand levels of commitment and dedication that can be tough to maintain in cultures that prize instant gratification and material success over long-haul spiritual development. The institutional resistance to these teachings also reaches beyond the traditional religious sphere. Today's educational systems are set up to crank out individuals who function efficiently within existing economic and social structures, not to develop the deep self-knowledge capacities that the Gospel of Thomas describes as fundamental to authentic human realization. This tension between contemporary education's goals and spiritual development's aims throws up complex challenges for those trying to weave these ancient teachings into their modern lives. The impact of mass media on collective consciousness is also a major player in how these texts are received today. The entertainment and advertising industries have cooked up sophisticated techniques to grab and steer human attention toward goals that are fundamentally at odds with the kind of contemplative practice these texts describe. The capacity for sustained contemplation and deep introspection. which are prerequisites for truly grasping Gnostic teachings, has become rarer and rarer in populations constantly barraged by stimuli designed to keep the mind in a state of continuous distraction. Despite these hurdles, there's growing evidence that a significant number of people are getting hip to the forms of spirituality these texts represent. Secular meditation movements, mindfulness practices, and various forms of transpersonal therapy have carved out contexts where the perspectives preserved in the Gospel of Thomas can find practical application without demanding adherence to specific doctrinal systems. This trend suggests that the fundamental human needs these texts address remain relevant, no matter how cultural and religious forms shift. Contemporary academic research into these texts has also peeled back the layers on the psychological sophistication of the spiritual techniques they describe. The self-knowledge methods found in the Gospel of Thomas show a deep grasp of the processes by which human consciousness can transcend its usual limitations. This sophistication suggests that the authors of these texts had access to spiritual knowledge traditions forged through centuries of practical experimentation and careful observation of consciousness transformation processes. The implications of this research reach into contemporary neuroscience, where studies on meditation and altered states of consciousness have started to provide scientific validation for many of the phenomena these ancient texts describe. The convergence between neuroscientific research and the experiential descriptions preserved in texts like the Gospel of Thomas suggests these ancient documents might hold practical info about human potential that's still relevant for contemporary scientific inquiry. However, integrating these perspectives into the academic research context presents unique hurdles. Contemporary scientific research methodologies are built to study phenomena that can be objectively observed and replicated under controlled conditions. The types of spiritual experience the Gospel of Thomas describes are inherently subjective and demand deep transformations in the researcher's consciousness, which can clash with traditional scientific objectivity expectations. This tension between contemporary scientific methods and the forms of knowledge these texts represent mirrors deeper limitations in Western epistemologies. The Western intellectual tradition has developed a strong preference for forms of knowledge that can be externally verified, which has led to the systematic sidelining of knowledge forms that depend on the transformation of the knower's consciousness. The Gospel of Thomas represents an epistemological tradition that recognizes certain types of knowledge can only be accessed through fundamental shifts in the very structure of consciousness itself. The ramifications of this epistemological difference spread across all areas of human knowledge, including psychology, medicine, education, and even the physical sciences. If the perspectives preserved in these ancient texts hold water, then the limitations in contemporary Western epistemologies might be blocking access to forms of knowledge that could be crucial for tackling many of humanity's deepest challenges. The rediscovery of these texts has also coincided with ecological and social crises that many observers see as symptoms of fundamental limitations in the forms of consciousness dominating contemporary civilizations. The teachings preserved in the Gospel of Thomas describe consciousness transformations that could be relevant for developing the psychological and spiritual capacities needed to effectively tackle these global challenges. Profound imbalances within human consciousness often lie at the root of our current predicaments. From this vantage point, technical and political solutions, while undoubtedly significant, may prove inadequate without corresponding transformations at the deeper strata of human awareness. This understanding inherently presents both opportunities and formidable challenges for those endeavoring to apply the wisdom of these ancient texts to contemporary issues. The process of integrating these perspectives into modern life necessitates a careful navigation, balancing respect for ancient wisdom with the imperative to adapt these teachings to cultural and social contexts fundamentally distinct from their origins. Such adaptation demands sophisticated discernment to identify the essential principles that retain their relevance, while simultaneously shedding the specific cultural forms that may be less appropriate for our contemporary setting. The communities that have coalesced around the study and practice of these teachings have developed diverse approaches to this integration. Some have focused on the academic reconstruction of original practices, while others have emphasized the creative adaptation of underlying principles to contemporary needs. The sheer diversity of these approaches reflects both the profound richness of the original teachings and the inherent complexity of the challenges involved in their contemporary application. As more individuals become familiar with these texts and the perspectives they represent, A more nuanced understanding of their relevance in addressing the spiritual and psychological challenges of the contemporary world is emerging. This nascent comprehension suggests that the Gospel of Thomas and similar texts may represent spiritual resources that were effectively lost to Western civilization for centuries, yet are now re-emerging at a moment when they may be particularly crucial. The convergence of historical factors that has enabled the rediscovery of these texts, including archaeological breakthroughs, advancements in academic scholarship, and shifts in cultural attitudes toward spirituality, strongly suggests we are experiencing a period of significant transition in the evolution of human consciousness. The teachings preserved within the Gospel of Thomas may well represent crucial elements in this transition, offering spiritual resources that have largely been absent from the Western mainstream for nearly 2 millennia. The long-term impact of recovering these teachings on the evolution of human consciousness remains uncertain. Yet current trends indicate they will continue to gain relevance as more individuals recognize the limitations of conventional forms of spirituality and seek out more authentic and transformative alternatives. The wisdom preserved within these ancient texts offers perspectives that may prove essential for navigating the complex challenges confronting humanity in the 21st century, providing spiritual resources that have demonstrably proven their worth through centuries of practice and reflection.